Hi, welcome back to Sustaining Creation, a faith journey for small groups. You've made it. You've made it. This is the 8th and final session, but it's not all downhill. We can see the finish line, but it's not yet all downhill. We still got a hill to go and some curves to take. We still got some difficult things to ponder together. Now that we know what God is calling us to be, how do we become that? How do we become the people needed for this time? How do our faith communities become the centers of transformation necessary for this time? How does the church become the significant agent for change that's big enough and powerful enough to move our society to a sustainable life? How do we do this? I would suggest that we have to become what I call passionately compassionate. We have to be the people rooted in the prime commandment of love. What do I mean by that? A number of years ago, every Sunday night for a year, I drove a van that picked up the homeless and took them to whichever church happened to be on the rotation to host them that night. And it was a real eye-opening experience for me to see how the homeless cared for each other, but also to see how the church, the people of the church, responded to the homeless. So I would pull the van full of people up, and we'd stop, and I'd turn off the engine, open up the van doors, and let them go over to the church, and they'd open the doors of the church, and then they'd go down into the basement, always into the basement of the church, and there the people of the church would be gathered behind tables to greet the homeless coming in. And on the tables would be the rules. This is when dinner is. This is when the quiet time is. This is when the sleep is. These are when you're going to get your bag lunches. You understand the rules, then sign it. Very formal. Except for one church. I pulled up one Sunday night to a church I hadn't been to. And before I even got the van in park, the church doors burst open. People come flying out, running over to the van saying, "Oh, we've missed you. We've missed you. Come, tell us how you've been. We've got a hot meal for you. We've got comfortable beds. We've got hot showers. Come, share with us. How are you? We've missed you." That's what it's going to take to change our society. It's not all the scientific presentations. Though as an engineer, I really like the scientific presentations, particularly the graphs. I really like the graphs. But that's not what changes society. What changes society is when they see a people that are passionate about the need to respond to this crisis with all the sacrificial love we have in our hearts. That will change society. Is there a basis for this? Yeah, there's a gospel basis for this. Again and again and again in the gospel, somebody goes up to Jesus with the question. Or they might say, "Dear sir," or "Good teacher," or "I've got a question." But the question is always this: what's the most important thing to do? And Jesus' answer is always the same. Love God, love neighbor, love yourself. And the people could not accept that. Particularly in the Gospel of Luke, it's a lawyer. And so he wants to qualify, well, just who is this neighbor I have to love? And in response, Jesus tells him the Good Samaritan story. You know that story. A man goes on the road to Jericho, and along the way, robbers set on him, beat him nearly to death, and leave him on the side of the road to die. And a couple of religious come along at different times, and they walk over the other side to avoid being contacted with him. And finally, a Samaritan, a despised Samaritan, comes along and compassionately loves and heals the man. Here's the thing. If we're to move the story a couple thousand years forward to the present time, in terms of the climate change, we're not the victims. No, the victims are on the other side of the globe, those people who are already dying from starvation and suffering from the floods and the droughts and the severe storms. No, we're not the victims. The victims are our children, our grandchildren, in the years to come as that moves forward to here. And no matter what our civilization says, we can't cope with it if we keep doing what we're doing. We're not even the religious that went over to the other side of the road. No. In this story, we're the robbers. We're the ones that are stealing the ability for people to eat and to drink and to simply survive. We're the ones stealing the future from our kids. Passionately compassionate. God's calling us to leapfrog from being the robbers to being the passionately compassionate healer, the one willing to set aside everything else and make the sacrifices necessary to heal this earth. Passionately compassionate. That's the gospel. So we're going to go out and meet with the other wisdom leaders and get their insights on what God is calling us to do and how we should act to get there. And then we'll wrap up and we'll greet back at the end. Enjoy the journey. There's still some tough potholes to get across. You can do it.
You know, everything's in supersize me culture. Bigger is better, always, right? In the eyes of Jesus, faithful is better. And that's one of the challenges I think we face is sometimes faithful doesn't get you the prize in terms of cultural measurements in the here and now, but it does produce fruits of the character of faith, perseverance, integrity, endurance to run this race, which will take a lot of running and a lot of people to run with us. To teach our children courage, because we'll have to be courageous. You know, I go back to that Laura story. Unless there's somebody who gives a damn, nothing will change. And we've got to care enough to be courageous and to measure the cost, because there's a cost, and a daily cost, and because we're so, one of the challenges, I think anybody hearing this will know and maybe resonate with what I'm about to say, the challenge is I'm daily enmeshed in the system of got to buy this or that. I mean, I got to buy stuff to exist, right? I got to buy clothes, got to buy food, got to pay the bills. How do you then find ways to disconnect from the fossil fuel energy sources? How do you find ways to disconnect from cheap labor practices that hurt our brothers and sisters? Going away from a lot of, when we go grocery shopping, half of the things that we used to buy, we would never dream of buying anymore because of how it's grown, of what chemicals are put into it, and how it's produced and packaged. And we say, no more. I'm not going to support that anymore. We're going to buy local, buy organic, and buy organic just not because somebody slaps organic on a label, but no pesticides, no hormones, no growth additives, no chemicals. If I can't look at the ingredients and know what it is, I'm not touching it. But that's tough. It takes awareness it takes daily choices to say, and sometimes the cost of those things sometimes are more economically, but you choose to do that because you can't maybe change the world in a second, but you can say, here I am, God, use me.
There's another little art installation. It's a pole where there's kind of like artistically done graffiti on the pole. It says, when an I becomes a we, even illness becomes wellness. So I mention all that to say that I think it applies to how we address climate change, is that we can't address it alone as individuals, as those atomized persons. We have to address it with other people, and that's one of the gifts that church brings, is it brings us these pre-made communities where we can connect with people sitting next to us in the pew, we can connect with people at a church potluck, and all that is giving us the fortitude that we need to be able to address something like climate change.
So one of the biggest things that gives me hope right now with respect to the climate justice movement is what some youth are doing to create a precedent in our legal system to force governments to take more action on climate change. There's a group of 21 youth ranging from single digits up through college working with a legal nonprofit. They've sued the federal government for lack of action on climate change. And this case is based on the public trust doctrine, which states that it is the duty of the government to protect natural resources that are essential for our collective prosperity and survival, especially for future generations. And they are arguing that, of course, that the atmosphere is one of those natural resources that needs to be protected. The case is big because the federal government and the representatives from the 3 fossil fuel trade associations tried to get the case dismissed back in spring. And so it was the federal government and the 3 fossil fuel trade representatives, big oil, against the kids, trying to get this case dismissed. And the judge sided with the kids, and that decision was under review. And the judge just last week put out their decision that they can continue the case. They're going to allow the case to go to trial instead of it being appealed, which is huge. There have been some state level wins by some youth who have sued the state level governments, for instance in Massachusetts and Washington, and so those state governments have had to go back and do more work with respect to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's the biggest shining hope for me at this point. And I'm trying to let every young person that I know, that I can know, that it is the youth that are doing this, and they are using their talents, they are using their art and music and their voices to potentially create a huge change in the way we function as a country, and at the state level too.
Consider preaching your sermon on your congregation's call to become an Acts 2:44 community, sharing all things in common. Imagine tens of thousands of congregations engaged in an Acts 2:44 movement consisting of a myriad of local experiments in democratized ownership and in pooling resources to leverage community engagement and economic revitalization. Here's an example that motivated an entire congregation to tears. So this is from one of our churches in Massachusetts. As the economy plummeted in 2008 and early 2009, while many churches hunkered down during that period, others stepped up to the challenge. At the height of the crisis on a Sunday morning in January 2009, a pastor in Western Massachusetts invited concerns and celebrations. An elderly woman stood. She was a well-known widow, not a person of means. With tremors in her voice, she asked people for prayers. She told them that she just could not make her next month's mortgage payment. She feared being tossed out of her house. Then she sat down. Her pastor, in her bones, knew exactly what she had to do. She stood and she declared in a quiet but firm voice, "No one in this congregation will lose their home to foreclosure." And then she sat down, trembling. She had no idea how that they could make that happen. The only thing she knew for sure was God might grab their congregation and do something. 2 weeks later, during the time for celebrations and concerns, a different elderly woman who was known by the congregation to live only off of her Social Security check, she stood up. She began by apologizing for taking 2 weeks to do the math. Then she said, "I just wanted you all to know that I'll cover February." And then she sat down. Few had ever experienced such a spirit-filled moment. This congregation was beginning to live into a new story. Amidst their joyful tears and relentless news of recession went on, and yet a miracle was unfolding there in their house of worship. 2 weeks later, another person in the congregation stood up during concerns and prayers. All he said was, "I've got March."
There's one last writer I want to introduce us to, and it's a Native American writer. His name is Thomas King. The book is The Truth About Stories, a Native Narrative. Thomas King is a wonderful storyteller. Native Americans have a long history of using story to guide not only an understanding of the history that they've gone through, but to guide the future. And Thomas King's books are filled with stories providing that kind of guidance. But what I want to spend time with is how he ends every one of his stories, because it's important for us to hear that now in this very last session. He ends every story with words like this. So that's the new story. It's yours. Do with it what you will. Tell it to friends. Turn it into a television movie. Put it on a t-shirt or just forget it. But don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if only you had heard the story. You've heard it now. We're near the end of the 8 sessions. You've heard the story. You got to decide what you're going to do with it. What you're going to do with this knowledge of what we've done to the earth and what we're facing in order to make life viable for our kids and our grandkids and for all of God's children across the globe. You have to decide how you're going to respond. You're going to put it on a t-shirt? You're going to tuck it away on a bookcase? Or you're going to live it? Don't say, though, don't you dare say, that if only you'd known, then you would have acted. Because what we've done in this series is give you that knowledge. What are you going to do with it? What's the story that you're going to pass on to your friends, your family, your community, your church? What are the stories of what we've done and what we have to do to save our kids? What are you going to say? What story is going to guide the rest of your life beginning today? So before we get to the last action item, I'd like to take another moment with you, a brief moment, to reflect on where you're going with this. When I come away from a journey, particularly a hard journey like you've been on, a transformative journey like you've been on, I spend the next few days or weeks pondering just what am I called to be? How am I called to respond? And I'd like to suggest to you a motto. I'd like to suggest you become a burning bush. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a story about in the Middle Ages, a group of rabbis were gathered together arguing about Scripture to try and understand it, as they often do. But this particular day, the Scripture they were arguing about was the scene where Moses encounters the burning bush. And the question before them is, why was it necessary for the bush to burn but not be consumed? And after a long debate, the understanding they came to was this, that we don't know, Scripture doesn't tell us how many times Moses passed that burning bush before he noticed it. How many times did he walk past that burning bush before he noticed it? You're coming into a faith response to the climate crisis. It's not a sprint. It's a long race. It has to be done with urgency, but not at the cost of burning yourself up. You're called to be a passionate responder to this climate crisis, but be that burning bush that doesn't get consumed, that is passionate, that is on fire, but it doesn't get consumed. So that as you engage people every day, they'll eventually stop and look and wonder, what is it that is driving that passion? Why do you see something that they don't see? Can they possibly understand the climate crisis through you, through your actions, through your professed beliefs, through your passion? Can you be a burning bush? A couple years ago in Washington, D.C., we gathered together in the National Cathedral when the Pope was visiting the city to address congressmen before he went up to New York to give that very pivotal climate justice speech. but we were gathered as an interfaith community in Washington National Cathedral, and each faith offered a response to the climate crisis on how they understood God was calling them. And I want to share one reflection with you because it really stuck with me. It really imprinted on my soul. And those were words that were offered by the Reverend John Dorhauer. Let me read them. Our precious planet is dying. Whatever has kept us apart must now be cast aside. We who broker in hope, who stay attuned to the voice and movement of the sacred among us, who find light in the darkness, must unite in a single movement and a common cause. We must, as one, aspire humankind to live differently, or the earth will die, casting us all aside. Our voice matters. We can do this. Let us stand in solidarity, all people of faith, united for the preservation of the earth and the bounty and beauty it was created to sustain. If we're going to change our human civilization, our modern Western civilization, onto a path that will save the future for our kids and our grandkids, we need thousands of burning bushes so that everywhere our society turns, they see people with passion calling for an urgent response to this crisis and yet not being consumed so they can burn on to engage yet more people. Can you do that? Can you be a burning bush? Can you allow God's voice to speak through you that says, hey, take off your shoes. You're on holy ground, because all of creation is holy. The wind, the air, the water, the soil, and the sea. Take off your shoes. We're on holy ground. We're about at the end of this journey that you and I have been on together. And so the action item we're going to focus on is the very last one. You need to talk about them all, but look at this last one in depth. It's number 48. What does it say? It says, understand that at its heart, this is an issue which requires global political answers in response to a human-induced global crisis. Support global efforts to strengthen and speed up the Paris Climate Accord. In the Paris Climate Accord, for the first time in history, all nations of the earth came together and agreed climate change is real. It's happening now. It's human caused, and we have to respond with urgency. We have to respond with urgency at a time when the leaders are trying to get away from the Paris Climate Accord, when our leaders are trying to focus on American first. We have a global crisis, and we have to deal with it. We have to call the American society back to a leadership role in this to show the rest of the world what must happen if our kids are going to have a future. And so we have to fund this effort in the third world who can't afford the renewable energy technologies that they must have in place, because it doesn't matter where we burn the coal and the oil and the gas. As soon as it goes out in the atmosphere, it affects everything within 2 weeks. And so we have to fund the technology there, and we have to move with urgency here. If our kids are going to have a future, that oil, that coal, that gas has to stay right where it's at, deep in the ground. Is there a scripture for this? Yeah, there's a scripture for this. In the Gospel of John, the 13th chapter, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you shall also love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Here's the thing. The love that Jesus is talking about is not affectionate love. It's compassionate love. It's sacrificial love. It's being willing to give up my wants and my desires so that someone else has what's necessary to live. For future generations to have what's necessary to live means we have to end the era of fossil fuels now. That's number 48. It's a global crisis. We need to become the faith leaders that give the voice, the prophetic call to end fossil fuels now. Can we do this? Maybe not by ourselves, but knowing that God is with us. Yes, we can. I'll see you further along the journey. We're not ending here. This has simply, to this point, been a journey of gathering awareness and understanding of the global climate crisis and what our faith calls us to do in response to it. So see you in the future on the streets with protest signs. I'll see you in the public square talking about it. I'll see you in the halls of Congress lobbying your senators and your representatives. I will see you in the sanctuary, proclaiming it from the pulpit, in the church hall, talking about it over bread and wine. God is calling us to act, to respond to this global crisis. We can do this.